Egypt had just emerged from the colonial rule and immediately set out to build its own people's car. No engineers, no industry, no real chance. But they tried anyway. What they created was a strange hybrid of ambition and naivety. In the late 1940s, the vast British Empire began to collapse like a house of cards. One by one, its colonies lined up to break away, and the United Kingdom could no longer stop them. Egypt was especially eager to break free, and by the early 1950s, its push for independence led to a series of Anglo-Egyptian clashes, culminating in the Suez Crisis of 1956. That crisis, in turn, came dangerously close to escalating into a full-scale regional war that might have drawn in the two nuclear superpowers of the time, the USSR and the United States.
Had a huge desert tent erected on its carpeted deck. This meeting, conforming...
The lead-up to the Suez Crisis included a wave of anti-British protests in Egypt, culminating in what became known as Black Saturday in January 1952. In Cairo, as authorities looked the other way, angry Egyptian crowds looted and torched British-owned businesses, shops, hotels, cinemas, and car dealerships. Most of those sold vehicles produced by the British division of Ford, which had an assembly plant in Alexandria. That plant soon had to shut down entirely as the Suez conflict escalated. After the crisis ended in the spring of 1957, Egypt's second president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, turned toward import substitution. He called on the country to begin manufacturing its own refrigerators, televisions, washing machines, and eventually automobiles. This model would later be adopted in many developing countries, where national car industries were created by direct orders from the head of state. That approach had both strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, it made full use of state resources. On the other hand, it created fragile systems that often collapsed with the leader's departure or death. But in 1958, Nasser was still young, full of energy, and bursting with ambition. At the same time, Nasser understood perfectly well that Egypt couldn't develop its own car entirely on its own. So he turned his gaze toward Europe. Given the freshly ended Suez Crisis, negotiations with Britain and France for technical cooperation were out of the question. Egypt did have relatively good relations with the USSR and other Eastern Bloc countries. But in 1958, an Egyptian delegation traveled to the West German city of Neckarsulm, home to the headquarters of NSU Motorenwerke. The subject of the talks was the newly launched two-door sedan, the NSU Prinz, which had caught the Egyptians' attention. The two sides quickly reached an agreement. The German company would supply chassis, engines, and gearboxes, while Egypt would take care of the bodywork and interior locally. A newly formed company called the Egyptian Light Transport Manufacturing Company built a small factory outside Cairo, and starting in the summer of 1959, the first German CKD kits began to arrive. However, Egyptian engineers didn't manage to finish developing the original bodywork in time. So it was decided that the first batch of 25 chassis would be fitted with simple open bodies. As a result, the first Egyptian car wasn't a sedan, as originally intended. It was a buggy. And even calling it Egyptian was a stretch. The first production was only 55% locally sourced. It's also worth pausing to consider the name they chose for the car. The Egyptians didn't settle for something abstract or a lifeless alphanumeric code. Instead, they picked a name worthy of their ambitions, Ramses, in honor of the great Egyptian pharaoh. And to be fair, it sounds noble, far better than the usual soulless designations. The real challenge for the Ramses was not the German hardware, but the Egyptian production capabilities. For years, local manufacturers struggled to establish consistent output of body panels. And those few panels that did reach production were often of poor quality, crafted in a semi-handmade fashion. Or, as it was euphemistically called, using workaround technologies. Unlike its German sibling, the Ramses stood out not only for its angular lines and square wheel arches, but also for its large and uneven panel gaps. Still, that did not stop the Egyptians from expanding the lineup. A two-door sedan was soon added to the range, followed by a pickup and a panel van. Later, they reached out to the famed Italian coach builder Vignale, which developed the body and design of a convertible named Gamelia. In terms of styling, it was a major leap forward. Production of the first-generation Ramses continued until the end of 1962. According to unofficial estimates, around 1,100 vehicles were built in total, across all variants, including the Italian-bodied convertibles. In 1961, NSU launched production of the new Prinz 4, and since the Egyptians were entirely dependent on their West German partners, they had no choice but to retool their own factory to accommodate the next-generation bodywork. In 1962, the updated Ramses II was unveiled. The model range included a two-door sedan, a convertible, and a pickup truck. Compared to the first-generation car, the progress was evident. The new Ramses was noticeably larger and more spacious, powered by a 0.6-liter engine producing 30 horsepower, paired with a 4-speed synchronized manual gearbox, unlike the unsynchronized transmission used in the original. However, old problems lingered, namely, the production of the locally built body. Egypt still struggled to manufacture body panels in sufficient quantities. As a result, Ramses' production remained extremely limited. Even in the record year of 1970, only 688 cars were assembled. That meant the factory produced fewer than 60 units per month, and even those found few buyers due to their mediocre build quality. In an attempt to make the Ramses more competitive, the Egyptians introduced an updated version in 1966. It was grandly named Ramses III, although in reality it differed little from the second generation, aside from a slightly revised exterior. Unsurprisingly, the cosmetic changes failed to boost demand. Production continued in small batches, but interest kept dwindling until it reached minimal levels. By the late 1960s, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had completely lost interest in the national car project. Two key events followed shortly after. The German company NSU was absorbed by the Volkswagen Group, and the factory where the Ramses had been assembled was handed over to a direct competitor, the Nasr Automotive Manufacturing Company. Ironically, Nasr had also been founded by Nasr back in 1960 and was primarily engaged in assembling licensed Fiat models. Although a four-door version of the Ramses III sedan had already been developed, with at least one prototype built, all work on expanding the model lineup was quietly shut down. The remaining CKD kits were simply assembled, and by 1972, the story of Egypt's first car came to an end. Over 13 years of cooperation with NSU, just 1,700 kits were delivered to Egypt, far too few to consider the Ramses a truly mass-produced vehicle. Despite the patriotic appeal, Egyptians were in no hurry to part with their hard-earned pounds in favor of a national product, instead preferring imports from both friendly and not-so-friendly countries. Even before absorbing the Ramses brand, Nasr had already begun working with automakers from the Eastern Bloc, including Poland's FSO, Romania's ARO, and Yugoslavia's Zastava. Eventually, Polish Żuk vans began rolling off Egyptian production lines under the Ramses badge. At first, they were nearly identical to the originals, but later, the Egyptians redesigned the body and gave it a new name, Ra, in honor of the ancient Egyptian sun god. By the end of its production run, the vehicle had little in common with the Polish prototype. Nasr also assembled licensed Polonez and Polski Fiat, 125 models in Egypt. In the final years before halting production in 2009, the company switched to manufacturing models from Turkish automaker Tofaş. Still, this was not enough to save the company from bankruptcy. Even though the Nasr brand continues to enjoy a solid reputation in Egypt to this day. However, this is not the end of Egypt's automotive story. In 2017, after years of being dormant, the Nasr brand was officially revived. Today, Chinese Yutong buses are being assembled in Egypt under the name Nasr Sky, and production of Nasr-branded electric buses and batteries is expected to begin this year. As for Ramses, the company remained active until 2018, securing its place in history as Egypt's first car manufacturer and the maker of the first Egyptian passenger car, even if it was built on a German mechanical foundation.